Something very strange is happening right now in Washington. Just days after launching what was described as a decisive military campaign against Iran, the United States appears to be dramatically shifting its tone. The same administration that spoke about overwhelming force and long-term strategic objectives is now suggesting the conflict may already be close to ending. Donald Trump recently stated in an interview that the war with Iran is pretty much complete. According to him, Iran's military capabilities have been severely degraded. He claimed the country no longer has a meaningful navy, communication system, or air force, and that the United States is far ahead of the original military timeline. But when you step back and look at the broader situation, the picture becomes far more complicated, because wars between modern states are rarely decided in just a few days. Even when one side gains early tactical advantages, the strategic outcome usually unfolds over much longer periods of time. Iran, unlike many smaller regional actors, has spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Its military doctrine is built around survival and endurance. Rather than relying on conventional forces that can easily be destroyed in open battle, Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric warfare. That includes ballistic missiles, drones, underground military facilities, and a regional network of allied forces capable of operating across the Middle East. In other words, any war with Iran was never going to resemble a short, conventional campaign. And the early signs from the battlefield already suggest that the situation is far from simple. Reports indicate that the United States has lost a number of advanced MQ-9 Reaper drones during operations over Iran. These are not just expensive aircraft. They are a key part of America's intelligence and targeting system. Losing several of them in a short period of time suggests that Iran still retains significant defensive capabilities. At the same time, some of America's closest allies appear to be growing uneasy about the trajectory of the conflict. Israeli officials have reportedly begun discussing possible ways to de-escalate the situation. Not because Israel lacks military strength, but because prolonged escalation could have enormous consequences for the entire region. And those consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. One of the most immediate impacts of the conflict has been felt in global energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical oil shipping routes on the planet. A large portion of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow waterway every single day. Whenever military tensions rise in that region, global markets react almost instantly. Oil prices surged sharply during the early phase of the crisis, and financial markets around the world began reacting to the possibility of a prolonged Middle East war. Then something interesting happened. As soon as Trump suggested that the conflict might already be nearing its end, markets began stabilizing. Oil prices started falling, and stock markets quickly recovered their earlier losses. That sequence of events suggests that political messaging is playing a major role in shaping how this conflict is perceived globally. But there is another important dimension to this story, and that involves Russia. Around the same time these statements were being made, Trump reportedly spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin. During that conversation, Putin discussed possible ways the war could be brought to an end. This matters because Russia is deeply connected to global energy markets. Rising oil prices tend to benefit Russia economically, especially when global supply disruptions occur. If the conflict were to expand or prolong instability in energy markets, it could shift the global balance of economic power in unexpected ways. In other words, the war with Iran is not just a regional issue. It is part of a much larger geopolitical competition. Another key issue is the question of strategic objectives. When the conflict first began, the messaging from Washington suggested extremely ambitious goals. Some officials spoke about weakening the Iranian regime, destroying missile capabilities, and eliminating Iran's ability to project power across the Middle East. But as the conflict has unfolded, the goals appear to have shifted. More recent statements from officials emphasize destroying missile launch systems, damaging military infrastructure, and reducing Iran's ability to threaten shipping lanes. That kind of shift is not unusual in war. Military campaigns often evolve once commanders confront the realities of the battlefield. But it does raise an important question. If the original objectives were broader, and those objectives have not fully been achieved, what exactly does victory mean? Meanwhile, Iranian officials insist their military remains strong. They argue that Iran's weapons systems are largely produced domestically, meaning the country is not dependent on foreign suppliers to continue fighting. They also claim their military still possesses the motivation and capacity to sustain a long conflict if necessary. From their perspective, the conflict represents an existential struggle. And when wars are framed that way, they rarely end quickly. Which brings us back to the central contradiction in the current narrative. On one hand, political leaders in Washington are suggesting the conflict may already be nearing its conclusion. On the other hand, defense officials have indicated that the campaign may only be in its early stages. Those two messages cannot both be true at the same time. Either the war is winding down, or it is just beginning. History shows that conflicts in the Middle East rarely follow the timeline that policymakers expect. Strategic assumptions can collapse very quickly once events on the ground begin to evolve. What we may be witnessing now is simply the opening phase of a much larger geopolitical confrontation. A confrontation that involves not only Iran and the United States, but also Israel, Russia, China, and the global energy system itself. For now, the situation remains extremely fluid. Political narratives may shift from day to day. Markets will react to every new headline. The deeper strategic forces driving this conflict are still unfolding. And until those forces settle, it would be far too early for anyone to declare that the war is already over.